In 1945, as the Second World War was drawing to a close, something happened in the heart of the United States that almost sounds impossible today. In a quiet Midwestern town surrounded by cornfields, churches, and wooden houses, a group of men marched through the main street under armed guard. They were not invaders. They were not spies. They were not tourists. They were German soldiers, not just a few of them, but hundreds. And for a brief moment in history, this American town would have more Nazi soldiers living inside it than American civilians. No battles were fought. No bombs were dropped. And yet, the presence of these enemy troops would leave a deep and lasting impression on the people who witnessed it, and on the men who arrived believing everything they knew about America was a lie. While Nazi Germany never invaded the United States, more than 400,000 Axis soldiers would eventually set foot on American soil during World War II. They arrived not as conquerors, but as prisoners of war, captured across North Africa, Europe, the Atlantic, and even the skies above Germany. These men were shipped across the ocean to a country they had been taught to hate, fear, and underestimate. Many of them expected brutal treatment, starvation, humiliation, or even execution. What they found instead would shock them to their core, challenge everything Nazi propaganda had taught them, and in many cases, change the course of their lives forever. By the peak of the war, as many as 30,000 prisoners of war were arriving in American ports every single month. The United States built over 1,200 prisoner of war camps and hospitals across the country, in every state except Vermont, as well as Alaska and Hawaii. California alone hosted more than 100 camps, with Texas close behind. These camps were often placed in rural areas far from major cities, near farms, factories, and canneries that were struggling to survive after millions of American men left their jobs to fight overseas. The war had created a massive labor shortage, and the solution would come from an unexpected source: the enemy. One of those places was Eaton, Indiana, a town of roughly 1,400 people. When word spread that hundreds of German prisoners would soon arrive, reactions were mixed. Some residents were afraid, others were curious, and some were quietly excited. Earl Jefferson Sr., the town marshal, later admitted that while he worried about security, escape attempts, and public safety, one concern stood out above all others. He feared he wouldn't be able to keep the town's women away from the prisoners. It sounds almost humorous today, but it reflected a deeper truth about what happened when enemy soldiers were suddenly placed inside peaceful American communities. The arrival of German prisoners in Eaton was barely mentioned in newspapers at the time. Military regulations limited photography and reporting, partly for security reasons and partly to comply with the Geneva Convention, which forbade the public humiliation of prisoners of war. As a result, much of this history survived only through oral accounts, family stories, and scattered photographs preserved by local historical societies. What those stories reveal is a chapter of World War II that feels almost unreal when compared to the brutality unfolding simultaneously across Europe. The prisoners who arrived in Eaton and similar towns were not civilians. They were trained soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the German armed forces. Some were devoted Nazis. Others were not German at all, but Poles, Czechs, or men from occupied countries forced to fight under the German uniform. They were housed in camps surrounded by barbed wire, watchtowers, and armed guards, yet life inside these camps was unlike anything they had experienced before. The United States ran its POW camps in strict accordance with the 1929 Geneva Convention. Prisoners received adequate housing, medical care, clothing suitable for the climate, and food equal to that of American soldiers. For many Germans, this alone was astonishing. Letters sent home described meals of meat, bread, vegetables, and even dessert. Some prisoners admitted they ate better in captivity than they had in the German army. Many gained weight. Enlisted men could buy beer at camp canteens, while officers enjoyed wine. Recreational facilities were provided, including sports equipment, musical instruments, libraries, theaters, and even printing presses for camp newspapers. Prisoners were allowed to practice their religion, organize cultural events, and elect representatives to communicate grievances to camp commanders. They could send and receive letters and packages, censored but reliable. In some camps, prisoners were even issued passes allowing them to walk into nearby towns under limited supervision. This shocked many Americans, especially in the segregated South, where German prisoners were sometimes allowed to eat in diners that black Americans could not legally enter. Work was mandatory for enlisted prisoners, but it was regulated. They labored on farms, harvested crops, cut timber, and worked in factories unrelated to the war effort. In Eton, prisoners worked at canning plants, helping preserve food that fed both civilians and soldiers overseas. They were paid about 80 cents per day, a competitive wage for day labor at the time. The money could be spent at camp canteens or saved. By the end of the war, many prisoners returned to Europe with hundreds of dollars, money that would help rebuild their shattered lives and economies. Yet life in the camps was not without tension. Among the prisoners were hardcore Nazis who enforced loyalty to Hitler even in captivity. They held secret tribunals, threatened fellow prisoners who fraternized with Americans, and in some documented cases, murdered those deemed traitors. The U.S. military eventually separated these extremists into different camps, but the danger they posed remained real. Guards were not always sufficient, and discipline was sometimes maintained in unusual ways. In Eton, misbehaving prisoners were reportedly forced to kneel on gravel roads and turn stones over by hand, a humiliating but non-lethal punishment. Despite fears, escapes were rare. The geography alone made escape nearly pointless. A German soldier fleeing into rural America had no realistic way to return to Europe or rejoin the war. Still, some tried. In Arizona, a group of prisoners tunneled out of a camp in Papago Park in 1944. All were recaptured within weeks. One man, Georg Gärtner, escaped and successfully hid in the United States for decades under a false name. He worked, married, raised a family, and only revealed his true identity in the 1980s, later publishing a memoir titled Hitler's Last Soldier in America. What truly stunned many German prisoners was not just the material conditions, but the people. Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as brutal, uncultured, racially chaotic, and morally corrupt. Instead, prisoners encountered kindness, curiosity, and ordinary families trying to survive wartime hardship. Farmers thanked them for their labor. Children waved at them from behind fences. Women spoke with them through barbed wire. Some townspeople brought food, books, or gifts. Friendships formed. In some cases, love followed. Although it was illegal for prisoners of war to marry in the United States, relationships did develop. After the war, American women were allowed to travel to Europe to marry former prisoners, then return with them legally. Thousands of former POWs eventually immigrated to the United States, choosing to live in the very country they once fought against. Some returned to the towns where they had been held captive. In Eton, at least one former prisoner came back after the war and lived there for the rest of his life, becoming an active and respected member of the community. By the end of the war in Europe, more than 370,000 German prisoners were held in the United States, along with tens of thousands of Italians and several thousand Japanese. Compared to the horrific conditions faced by prisoners in Soviet camps, American captivity was humane, structured, and often unexpectedly fair. This contrast was not lost on the prisoners themselves. Many later said that their time in America destroyed their belief in Nazi ideology more effectively than any battlefield defeat. As the war ended, the United States began repatriating prisoners. Not all wanted to leave. Some feared returning to Soviet-controlled territories. Others had fallen in love with America. After reports of massacres involving returning German soldiers handed over to Soviet authorities, the U.S. quietly stopped repatriating certain groups. A few prisoners escaped transport altogether and disappeared into American society. The camps were dismantled, tents removed, fences torn down. Fields returned to farmland. Towns like Eton moved on. Today, little remains to mark where these camps once stood. No monuments, no museums, no warning signs. Yet the legacy endures in family stories, faded photographs, and the quiet truth that during World War II, the United States not only defeated its enemies on the battlefield, but confronted them with a living example of a different kind of power.